Today I'm going to share with you the results of my input latency test for Apex Legends. I calculated the time in milliseconds between a controller button press and the change in state of the pixels on my computer monitor. In my first test, I compared a wireless Xbox One controller to a wired PowerA Fusion Pro controller, both on the Xbox Series X. In my second test, I compared a wireless Xbox One controller on the Xbox Series X to a wired Xbox One controller on a gaming PC laptop, the Dell G7. I'll cover test 1 first, comparing the Xbox One controller to the PowerA Fusion Pro on the Xbox Series X. My test system consisted of an Xbox Series X with the BenQ EX2780Q monitor set at 120 frames per second in the Xbox operating system. The monitor has a pixel rise and fall time of 5 milliseconds. My server ping was 20 to 30 milliseconds during the test, and Apex runs at 60 FPS on all consoles. So the average expected latency is going to be 25 milliseconds for the server ping, 5 milliseconds for the monitor response time, plus some latency due to the 60 FPS of the game. So this comes out to about 40 milliseconds on average. This is before taking into account the controller, OS, and application, which is Apex Legends. Before I get into the results, I wanted to give some background on how a modern controller works so you understand my methodology. So on the bottom of a controller button, there is conductive material. When the button is pressed down, this conductive material touches a board that has an incomplete circuit. So when you press the button, it places the conductive material that is on the bottom of the button in contact with the board, thus completing the circuit and allowing electricity to flow through the circuit. This event then triggers the controller to send information to the game console. When you press down on the button, there is a switch, so my test measured the time between the sound of the switch clicking and when the monitor's pixels changed. I used a camera set at 120 frames per second to record the test. Here are the results of the test. The column toward the right labeled difference frames is the number of frames between the sound of the button switch and the change in the state of the pixels on the monitor. So I connected the gunfire to the A button on the controller. So this is the number of frames between pressing the A button and the change in the number of bullets in the magazine of my gun. The left table is the test performed 14 times with a wireless Xbox One controller. The right table is the test performed 14 times with a PowerA Fusion Pro controller. So as you can see, they were virtually identical. Both took around 9 frames between the sound of clicking the button and the change in the number of bullets in the magazine. So 9 frames is equal to about 75 milliseconds. One caveat is that I didn't wait for the pixels on the monitor to completely change. I measured to when the pixels on the monitor first began to change. So if you recall, I previously estimated that the average expected input latency before taking into account the controller, OS, and application was 40 milliseconds. So my test resulted in an input latency of 75 milliseconds. So those 3 factors added about 35 milliseconds of latency, which is a lot. Another conclusion of test 1 is that the PowerA Fusion Pro seems like a good quality controller with the same input latency of a standard Xbox One controller. In my second test, I had a similar setup. I used the same monitor and I used the Xbox One controller wired to a Windows 10 laptop. I was running Apex at 120 frames per second instead of at the 60 FPS that Apex is capped on all consoles currently. So I expected significantly better input latency on PC than on the Xbox Series X simply from the better frames per second. Again, I tested the input latency in the firing range of Apex Legends by measuring the time between the sound of a button click and the change in the pixels on my monitor. Here are the results. So instead of the 75 milliseconds of input latency on the Xbox Series X, the average input latency on PC was about 21 milliseconds, which was lower than what I was expecting. Some of this difference can be attributed to slightly better server ping perhaps on PC during my test, but at most that would account for 10 milliseconds. So a conservative estimate is that the input latency for Apex on PC running at 120 FPS is 35 to 40 milliseconds better than Apex on the Xbox Series X running at 60 FPS. The overall conclusions of my testing are the following. First, the PowerA Fusion Pro has the same input latency as a standard Xbox One controller. Second, the input latency of Apex Legends on the Xbox Series X console is terrible when compared to PC. Input latency is probably at least twice as high on console as it is on PC. This is why it is so important for Respawn to upgrade Apex on next-gen consoles. There is no technical reason why the input latency of Apex on next-gen consoles can't be the same or even better than it is on PC, and when this happens, all of the next-gen console gamers are going to have a major advantage. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe.
You are the Apex Champions.